My girlfriend stood in front of everyone and said, "I'm cheating on you with your friend. He is better than you," just to humiliate me, but my cold response left her crying and exposed. Before we go on, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which city you're tuning in from. My name is Akobo. I'm 27 years old, and I never thought I'd end up writing something like this on the internet. But after what happened, I feel like I need to put it into words to understand it myself. I was with Francisca for 8 months. It wasn't a long relationship in absolute terms, but it was long enough for me to get emotionally involved. At first, everything seemed stable. We met through a mutual friend's work. We started dating, and during the first few months, everything was normal. Long conversations, spontaneous plans, small details that made you believe you were building something solid. However, around the third or fourth month, I started noticing things that made me uncomfortable, although I never wanted to give them too much importance. It wasn't anything concrete. I couldn't point to a specific event and say, "This is what's wrong." It was more of a persistent feeling, a kind of mismatch between what she said and what she did. Francisca had a very particular way of arguing. When she didn't like something, she didn't say it directly. She'd stay silent for hours or even days. Then, when the tension was already obvious, she'd explode with comments that weren't aimed at the specific problem, but at me as a person. She didn't say, "What you did bothered me." She said, "You're always like this, or you never do anything right." I tried to stay calm, but little by little those phrases started to wear me down. The arguments became more frequent in the 7th month. They weren't fights about important things. They were tiny details, a message I answered late, a plan I changed for work reasons, an outing with friends I didn't warn her about with enough notice. Every disagreement ended up escalating more than necessary. There was something that started repeating itself, and that unsettled me more than the content of the fights. In the middle of the arguments, she started saying phrases like, "You're going to regret talking to me like this," or "Don't you know who you're talking to?" At first, I took it as an impulsive reaction born of anger, but over time it stopped sounding like a momentary exaggeration and started looking like a warning. I was never unfaithful to her. I never insulted her or raised my voice. If I did something wrong, I tried to fix it. However, she insisted that I treated her badly. When I asked her for concrete examples, she'd answer with generalities. That lack of clarity confused me. It made me question if I was being insensitive without realizing it. There was also another element I preferred to ignore for too long, her closeness with one of my friends, Andres. Andres and I have known each other since college. He was always someone charismatic, sociable, the kind of person who draws attention without trying too hard. When Francisca met him, I noticed they got along well, but I never saw anything openly inappropriate. However, there were looks, inside jokes, and comments that made me uncomfortable. Once I calmly mentioned to her that it seemed like she and Andres were too close. I didn't accuse her of anything. I just expressed that it made me feel weird. Her reaction was disproportionate. She told me I was being insecure, that I was projecting my fears onto her, and that those kinds of jealousy would ruin the relationship. I felt embarrassed for having mentioned it. From then on, I stopped saying anything that could be interpreted as mistrust. I thought the problem was mine. The day of the gathering was the breaking point, although I didn't know it at the time. It was a small gathering at a group friend's house. It wasn't a big party. We were about 10 people. Almost all of us had known each other for years. The idea was simply to have dinner and talk. From the moment we arrived, I noticed Francisca was distant. She barely spoke to me, and when she did, it was with short answers. On the other hand, she was especially animated when she talked to Andres. They laughed a lot. I try not to give it importance. I kept telling myself I shouldn't fall into insecurity again. At some point in the night, the conversation split into small groups. I was talking in the kitchen with 2 friends about work. Francisca was in the living room with Andres and other people. From where I was, I could hear fragments of their conversation. It wasn't anything explicit, but the tone made me uncomfortable. When I got closer to the living room, she made a comment I didn't fully hear. I only saw how Andres laughed, and she stared at him. Noticing my presence, Francisca changed her expression. It was subtle but obvious. I asked her if we could talk privately for a moment. I didn't do it with anger. I just wanted to understand what was going on. We went out to the apartment's balcony. That's where the argument started. I asked her why she'd been so distant with me all night. She replied that I was the one acting weird. I told her I just wanted to know if something was bothering her. Then the tone changed. She told me she was tired of my scenes, that I always found a reason to get uncomfortable over things that were only in my head. I reminded her I hadn't said anything all night, that I'd simply noticed a certain attitude. She smiled in a way I found hard to interpret. That's when she said it again. Someday you're going to regret talking to me like this. That phrase repeated for the third or fourth time in the last month made me lose my patience for the first time. I didn't yell at her, but I asked her to stop talking in threatening terms. I told her if there was something she wanted to say to me, she should do it directly. She crossed her arms and looked at me with a mix of defiance and superiority. She told me I couldn't handle hearing the truth. I replied that I preferred that to continuing with insinuations. The argument started to heat up, not in volume, but in content. She accused me of being insecure, of not being on her level, of needing constant validation. I told her it wasn't that I simply needed consistency, that I couldn't keep pretending I didn't see certain dynamics. At that moment, she opened the balcony door and went back to the living room without finishing the conversation. I followed her. The tension was already obvious. Some people stopped talking when we walked in. She didn't try to keep a low profile. On the contrary, she sat on the couch next to Andres and, in front of everyone, said loudly that she was tired of my possessive attitude. I tried to stay calm. I asked her not to expose the problem in front of the others. It was a mistake. She stood up immediately and, with a smile that seemed calculated, said that maybe what I needed was to learn from someone who didn't know how to treat a woman. She looked at Andres, then looked back at me. At that instant, I felt something was going to break, but I still couldn't imagine to what extent. At that moment, while she was standing in front of everyone, I felt something I hadn't felt before. It was as if all the pieces I'd avoided putting together for months suddenly fell into place in my head. It wasn't a slow process, it was immediate. A clear and brutal idea crossed my mind. She's cheating on me, and now she wants to humiliate me in front of everyone. I understood it a second before she opened her mouth. I saw how she slightly lifted her chin, how her posture became more rigid, more theatrical. She wasn't losing control. She was acting. She was choosing the stage and the moment. Then she raised her voice. I'm sorry to inform you all that Jacobo is barely a man. He doesn't know how to treat a woman. That's right, Jacobo. I'm cheating on you with Andres. He treats me much better than you, and besides, he does it better than you. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't an awkward murmur or a nervous laugh. It was a total void. I could hear the distant sound of a car passing down the street. Nobody moved. Nobody said anything. I felt my chest tighten, but it wasn't pain, it was clarity. Everything I'd suspected without wanting to accept was confirmed. The looks, the ambiguous phrases, the warnings of you'll regret it. They weren't emotional impulses, they were preparations. She wanted this. She wanted to expose me. She wanted me to react. She wanted me to explode, to yell, to insult her first so she could position herself as the victim. I saw it in her eyes. She was expecting a scene. For a moment I thought about saying something rational, something mature, but I understood that wasn't what she was looking for. She didn't want dialogue. She wanted a spectacle, and I decided not to give her exactly what she expected, but I wasn't going to stay quiet either. I took a deep breath. Okay, I said with a surprisingly stable tone. The truth is I'm not surprised. You look so much like a slut that I'd be surprised if you were faithful. The change in her expression was immediate. The theatrical pride on her face broke for a fraction of a second. She didn't expect me to answer like that. She expected begging or uncontrolled rage. I continued before she could interrupt me. Just look at how you dress. I don't want to sound sexist, but I've seen prostitutes with more decent clothes. Some people looked away. Others just watched as if they were seeing something they couldn't process. Andres was motionless, serious, without intervening. I want to clarify something. For months, she'd constantly tried to make me jealous. If we walked down the street and some guy looked at her, she'd point him out. She'd say they'd been staring at her. She said it with a mix of satisfaction and defiance. She wore extremely tight clothes to gatherings where she knew I'd be uncomfortable. When I mentioned how it made me feel, she called me insecure. It wasn't the clothes themselves that bothered me. It was the intention. It was the constant game of creating competition, of testing me in front of others. She reacted as if my comment confirmed exactly the character she wanted to assign me. "You're a sexist," she said, raising her voice. "You always have been. You want to control me. Does it bother you that others look at me because you know you're not up to par?" I didn't answer. I stood still. "You know what?" she continued. "Andres does know how to treat me. He does make me feel desired. Not like you who's always questioning everything." She kept talking. She called me insecure, mediocre, barely a man. She said I was emotionally dependent on her. She said I'd never really been on her level. Every sentence seemed designed to pierce. I listened to her. I didn't interrupt her. I didn't make gestures. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked at her while she spoke. At first her tone was firm, then it started to speed up. When a person meets no resistance, sometimes they start to overflow. It was no longer a structured speech. It was an unloading, an accumulation of resentment, of contempt, of things she'd probably wanted to say in public for a long time. Someone tried to intervene. I think it was one of her mutual friends, but she ignored him. "Always so proper," she said, pointing at me. "Always so calm, but inside you're bitter." I remained silent. It was easily 3 minutes, maybe more. Time got weird. I just listened to how she disqualified me over and over again. Nobody supported her. Nobody contradicted her. They just watched. And the more she talked, the more obvious something became. She wasn't humiliating me anymore. She was exposing herself. When she finally paused to breathe, I stared at her. "Are you done talking, or are you going to say something else?" My voice wasn't aggressive. It was flat, neutral. That phrase threw her off more than any insult. She expected me to compete, to yell, to justify myself, to try to defend my masculine pride in front of the group. Instead, I was giving her space to keep going if she wanted, as if everything she just said didn't have the impact she imagined. For the first time since the scene started, she hesitated. "No, you don't understand anything," she muttered, but not with the same confidence anymore. I was still standing calm. Inside there was disappointment, yes, but also a strange sense of liberation. The constant suspicion, the accumulated tension, the permanent doubt, everything had been exposed, without needing to keep interpreting ambiguous signs. I looked around. Some friends avoided eye contact. Others seemed uncomfortable with Andres, who was still sitting, rigid, without defending or denying her. The situation was no longer an attack on me. Now it was a raw scene that nobody knew how to handle. And I stopped there, not because I didn't have more to say, but because I understood that silence at that point weighed much more than any word. She stared at me. Her eyes no longer had the same defiant gleam as minutes before. There was something different, uncertainty. "Aren't you going to say anything?" she asked with a slightly broken voice. "Aren't you going to ask me why I did it? Aren't you going to fight for me? Aren't you going to try to fix everything so we can be happy together?" The question wasn't aimed only at me. It was aimed at the audience. She needed someone to validate that narrative. She needed someone to see in me the man who doesn't fight for his relationship. At that instant, one of the friends let out a small, nervous laugh. It wasn't an open laugh. It was that kind of involuntary laugh that comes out when something is absurdly incoherent. The sound broke the tension more than any word. I looked at her calmly. "Relax," I said. "You're not as indispensable as you think. I wouldn't fight for you even if I got paid. To me, you're nothing. A woman who does this automatically reduces herself to a talking lump that you shouldn't pay attention to." My words were harsh. I know. They weren't elegant or diplomatic, but at that moment, I wasn't trying to win moral approval. I was setting a clear boundary. She decided to turn our breakup into a public spectacle. I was responding on the same stage. Her expression changed completely. The pride disappeared. Her eyes filled with tears almost immediately. "I thought you," she started to say. I interrupted her. "What?" I asked without raising my voice. "Did you think I'd cry and ask why you did it? Did you think I'd ask to start from scratch and talk about our feelings? That I'd get on my knees so you wouldn't leave? You're wrong. I was an idiot for waiting so long for this to be confirmed, but we're done." The atmosphere was heavy. Nobody intervened. Nobody clapped. Nobody openly supported me, nor did they defend her. It was as if everyone was processing something that had strayed from any expected social script. She took a step towards me. "But a real man would fight for his woman," she said, now crying openly. That phrase made me understand something fundamental. It wasn't about love. It was about validation. She wasn't asking for understanding. She was demanding that I play the role she needed to feel desired, important, essential. "You're not my woman," I replied firmly. "You're Andres' woman, maybe, but I never loved you as a woman after all this." Andres, up until that moment, hadn't said anything. He remained seated, motionless, with a serious face. He didn't confirm or deny anything. He didn't take her hand. He didn't defend her. His silence was as revealing as his actions. Francisca looked at me as if she didn't recognize the person in front of her. Maybe because for months she'd seen me hesitate, try to talk, ask for explanations. That version of me was no longer there. "You can't talk to me like that," she said between sobs. "Not after everything we lived." "What we lived," I replied, "was a relationship where you constantly tried to make me insecure, where every argument ended with veiled threats, where you sought to make me feel replaceable. Today you just confirmed what you've been hinting at for months." She shook her head as if wanting to rebuild the narrative. "I just wanted you to react," she finally confessed. "To feel that you could lose me." That phrase laid everything bare. It wasn't about Andres. It wasn't about love. It was about power. "I'm not a trophy that needs to compete for its partner," I said. "If you needed to create a triangle to feel desired, the problem wasn't mine." Her tears were now constant. But even in that crying, there was something that caught my attention. It wasn't pain for having hurt me. It was frustration for not getting the reaction she expected. "I thought you loved me," she whispered. "Loving isn't tolerating public humiliations," I replied. "Loving isn't accepting that someone betrays you and then demands you fight for her in front of everyone." There was a long silence. Nobody moved. She tried something else again. "We can talk about it later," she said. "You don't have to decide right now. Are you mad?" I shook my head. "I'm not mad. I'm clear." That difference seemed to affect her more than any previous insult. When a person expects rage and finds structured indifference, they lose control of the script. "So is that it?" she asked. "That's it." Andres finally stood up, but he didn't approach her. He just said my name in a low tone, as if he wanted to intervene without knowing how. I looked at him briefly. "You don't need to explain anything," I told him. "What I needed to know, I already know. A friend's betrayal hurts, but at that moment my energy was focused on closing the chapter, not on opening another conflict." Francisca took a step back. Her breathing was uneven. "You can't end it like this," she said, almost pleading. "Not after 8 months. You were the one who ended it when you decided to make it public this way." She tried to get closer again, but I took a step back. That's when her posture changed completely. It was no longer confrontation. It was an emotional collapse. She covered her face with her hands and started crying more intensely. She looked around looking for support, but nobody moved to comfort her. Maybe because they'd all been turned into involuntary spectators of a scene she herself started. "It wasn't supposed to turn out like this," she said through tears. That phrase, more than any other, confirmed everything. She wasn't regretting the infidelity. She was regretting the outcome. I stayed still. There was nothing more to add. After a few seconds that seemed eternal, she turned sharply and ran out of the apartment. The door slammed shut behind her. The silence left behind was different from the beginning. It was no longer surprise. It was tense discomfort. Someone sighed. Another muttered that it had gotten out of control. I simply took a deep breath. I didn't feel victory. I didn't feel pride. I felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion, as if I'd been holding up an unstable structure for months, and it had finally collapsed under its own weight. Andres was the first to move. He slowly got up from the couch and walked towards me. His steps were unsure, as if he didn't know whether to approach or leave. When he stood in front of me, he avoided looking me directly in the eyes. "Bro, I don't know how it happened," he said in a low voice. I looked at him in silence for a few seconds. I didn't need an improvised speech. I didn't need technical details about how the betrayal happened. There was no version that could accommodate what had already occurred. I told you that you didn't have to explain anything, I replied, keeping my tone firm. Get out of my sight. You're just another piece of shit. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't push him. I didn't make any aggressive gesture, but my words were clear. He swallowed hard. If there's anything I could do, bro, you know we've been friends for years. That word felt almost absurd to me at that moment. Friend, I repeated, looking him directly in the eyes for the first time. You don't know what that word means. Get out. There was no more exchange. He didn't try to justify himself again. He didn't try to argue. He just nodded slightly, like someone who understands they have no possible argument, grabbed his jacket and left the apartment without looking back. When the door closed for the second time that night, the atmosphere changed. The gathering no longer existed as such. The music was off. The food was still on the table untouched. Nobody was in the mood to continue as if nothing had happened. One of the friends came over and put his hand on my shoulder. I'm sorry, he simply said. Another added that what she'd done had been unnecessary, that if there were problems, that wasn't the way to handle them, that nobody expected a scene on that level. I didn't receive long speeches or exaggerated comments. They were short, sincere phrases. Nobody celebrated my reaction. Nobody applauded my words, but they didn't justify what she'd done either. That was enough. I finally sat down on one of the chairs. I felt the exhaustion hit me all at once. It wasn't immediate sadness. It was the accumulated emotional exhaustion of months. Someone asked if I was okay. I answered yes, and surprisingly I was. Not happy, not satisfied, but at peace with the decision. The gathering ended shortly after. Some left in silence. Others offered to take me home. I appreciated the gesture, but I preferred to walk alone for a while. As I walked down the building stairs, I thought about everything I'd ignored during those 8 months. The warnings disguised as jokes, the subtle comparisons, the veiled threats that I'd regretted, the constant attempt to provoke jealousy to measure my reaction. What happened that night wasn't born there. It was just the public culmination of something that was already damaged. I also thought about Andres, about the years of friendship, about the shared moments, about the trust one places in certain people without questioning it too much. I didn't feel explosive hatred. I felt deep disappointment. The kind of disappointment that doesn't need yelling because it's final. When I got home, I checked my phone. I had several messages, some from the group asking how I was, others from numbers I didn't recognize, probably trying to find out more details. I didn't answer immediately. I sat in the dark living room for several minutes. I went over the entire scene in my mind. I tried to find something I could have done differently, but every time I went back to the moment she decided to announce her infidelity in front of everyone, I understood there was no room for negotiation anymore. She wanted a dramatic reaction. She wanted tears, begging, competition. She wanted to validate her worth through my desperation. She didn't get it, and that, more than any insult I threw at her, was what really broke her script. The next day, I found out through third parties that she tried to justify her behavior by saying she just wanted to make me react, that she didn't think I'd end everything so coldly, that she thought it would make me fight for the relationship. That narrative confirmed what I'd already understood that same night. When a person needs to publicly humiliate you to measure how much you love them, the problem isn't a lack of intensity, it's a lack of respect. I never spoke to her again. Andres didn't try to contact me again either. As the days passed, the story stopped being the group's main topic. Life went on. Work continued. Routines returned, but something inside me changed. I learned that respect isn't negotiated under social pressure. I learned that well-placed indifference can be more forceful than any yell. And I learned that not all relationships end with mature conversations and elegant goodbyes. Some end with a brutal revelation that simply confirms what you already knew but didn't want to accept. That was the last time I saw Francisca, and that was the last time I called Andres a friend.